Hello, my friends. War isn't just fought with tanks and missiles. It's fought with information, with sabotage, and with the truth that powerful people are terrified you'll discover. While the world celebrates Thanksgiving and pretends everything is normal, a geopolitical time bomb is ticking beneath the surface in Ukraine, in Europe, and in Washington itself. We dig into the one story the media doesn't want you to understand: the peace plan that could have ended the Russia-Ukraine war and the political forces that destroyed it. Was it incompetence, betrayal, or a deliberate move to ensure endless war? I'm here to break down the facts, what's really happening on the battlefield, who is sabotaging peace, and why Russia now holds every advantage. If you're tired of propaganda and ready for truth, you've come to the right place. Let's begin. Heat. It's Thanksgiving in the United States, and everyone is asking the same theatrical question: who is the turkey in this geopolitical drama? I can't bring myself to say Happy Thanksgiving while I'm still mourning for the historical crimes committed against people like Geronimo and while another proxy war rages in Eastern Europe. But I can say this: I sincerely hope efforts to bring the war in Ukraine to an end succeed. And I also believe that not everyone in Washington's power structure actually wants that to happen. Let me lay it out clearly. I genuinely believe that Donald Trump, whatever his many flaws, has tried to engineer an end to the war in Ukraine. I believe the 28-point peace plan he drew up after the Anchorage summit with Vladimir Putin was, at least at its core, a serious effort to stop this bloodletting. It was imperfect, it contained unrealistic elements, but it was at least pointing in the right direction toward negotiation rather than escalation. But that plan has been gutted from within. The man who, in my view, butchered that turkey is Marco Rubio, acting in concert with the bipartisan war party in Washington, a faction inside the Republican Party allied with virtually the entire Democratic Party establishment, backed by their media echo chambers and cheered on by the European Union's political lapdogs. Rubio, along with figures like Keith Kellogg and others, helped shape what started as a 28-point framework into something like 19 or 20 points. And in the process, they stripped out any provisions that could actually be acceptable to Russia. Anything amended to suit Ukraine and the Western narrative inevitably moved the framework further away from what Russia, the side that is currently winning on the battlefield, could even consider. The loser in war does not dictate the terms of peace. And right now, however much Western media may lie about it, Russia is winning this war militarily and strategically. Let's look concretely at what made this so-called amended peace plan a non-starter. First, NATO expansion by another name. One of the core reasons Russia launched the special military operation was to stop Ukraine becoming a NATO armed camp on its border. The entire operation, with all the blood, treasure, sanctions, demonization, and isolation Russia has endured, is rooted in that red line. Yet the revised Rubio version effectively allows Ukraine to join Western military structures, whether under a NATO badge or some European intervention force emblem. That is precisely the scenario Moscow launched the SMO to prevent. Expecting Russia to stop a war it is winning in order to accept that outcome is simply absurd. Second, the insanity of stationing European and British troops in Ukraine without calling it NATO. The plan envisions about 20 NATO members sending their forces into Ukraine, but not under NATO insignia. A legalistic fig leaf. French troops in Odessa, British troops perhaps around Kyiv, Latvians, Germans, and other European contingents rebranded as a European intervention force. History matters here. 100 years ago, French forces were in Odessa and were driven out ignominiously by the Red Army and the forces of the Bolshevik Revolution. They have not forgotten that humiliation. Macron clearly dreams of reversing it. If those forces go in, it is guaranteed that Russia will treat them as hostile foreign troops encroaching on a vital security frontier. Russia has been invaded repeatedly through Ukraine by Napoleon, by the Kaiser, by Hitler. For Russian strategists, Ukraine is a dagger pointed at Moscow and St. Petersburg. They have made Ukraine the red line precisely because history taught them that this corridor is the invasion route of choice for their enemies. Now add in the open talk in Western think tanks and media that Russia is too big, too rich, and must be broken into 5, 7, 10 smaller states, a balkanized, controllable resource colony. That is the clearly stated objective of many Western elites. Moscow hears this, remembers history, and draws the obvious conclusion. Any plan that positions Ukraine as a permanent forward base for those forces is a plan for endless war, not peace. Third, the theft of Russian sovereign assets. Rubio's mutilated version requires Russia to accept the outright confiscation of about 100 billion euros of its sovereign wealth, stolen and then spent by the EU and NATO on Ukraine's reconstruction. And let's be clear, they don't mean reconstruction of the territories that chose to join Russia after referendums. They mean using Russia's money to rebuild the Kiev-controlled rump state that remains loyal to Zelensky and Western interests. It is a grotesque demand. No Russian taxpayer will accept watching Russia's savings used to subsidize an openly hostile regime that has been shelling and killing Russians and Russian speakers for years. Fourth, demilitarization turned on its head. Demilitarizing Ukraine was one of the fundamental objectives of the SMO. Back in the Istanbul talks, Russia indicated a willingness to accept a Ukrainian army of about 60,000, enough for basic territorial defense, but not large enough to threaten Russia or stage offensive operations. The SMO itself began with Ukraine having about 260,000 troops, including over 60,000 NATO-trained forces preparing to attack Donbass and crush the breakaway republics. Trump's original plan already stretched Russian tolerance by proposing a 600,000-strong Ukrainian army, far beyond what Russia had signaled as acceptable. But Rubio's sabotage goes further. He pushes that number to 800,000, a standing army larger than any in Europe, and almost 10 times the size of Britain's entire armed forces. Ukraine cannot afford that. European taxpayers would be forced to subsidize it. British taxpayers, already hammered by record tax burdens and budgets of austerity and cold, would be conscripted financially and potentially in blood to keep a gigantic anti-Russian army on Russia's doorstep. Fifth, a Chapter 5 security guarantee stricter than NATO's Article 5. The plan envisions an EU-led security pact that would compel member states to intervene militarily if any breach of the agreement is detected. NATO's Article 5, in practice, only obliges members to consider an attack on one as an attack on all. Rubio's model goes further. A European Chapter 5 that practically guarantees a continental-scale war in response to any incident, any false flag, any provocation staged by extremist elements or intelligence services. This is a recipe for permanent hair-trigger confrontation between Europe and a nuclear-armed Russia. Taken together, these clauses don't just undermine the possibility of peace, they guarantee the continuation of war and raise the risk of a wider European conflict. They take what might have been an imperfect but potentially workable Trump peace framework and convert it into a new war plan. A plan that, once Russia inevitably rejects it, will be used by Washington and European elites to justify renewed arms spending, conscription, and escalation. And here we come to the key point. This sabotage is not an accident. Internal leaks, intercepted calls, and the behavior of players like Kellogg and Rubio show a pattern. Phone calls between senior Russian officials and intermediaries like Steve Witkoff have been intercepted, probably by European intelligence services. Perhaps Baltic and cherry-picked transcripts were handed to Bloomberg to discredit the process. Someone is breaking the law and abusing intelligence capabilities to prevent any rapprochement between Washington and Moscow. The motive is obvious. Certain factions in the US and Europe fear peace more than they fear war, because peace would expose their failures and remove their leverage. In Russia, the strategic thinking is stark and simple. Any agreement to end the SMO must ensure that Russian sons and daughters will not have to fight this war again in 10 or 20 years. That is their bottom line. A Ukraine that can host foreign troops from France, Britain, Germany, Latvia, and others even if they remove their NATO patches and so on, some EU intervention badge ensures that the war will return. A Ukraine that can field an 800,000-strong army bankrolled by Western taxpayers ensures that this army will sooner or later be pointed at Russia again. Under those conditions, why would Moscow stop the war now when its forces have momentum, when Ukrainian defenses are collapsing, and when Russia can obtain by force what no one is prepared to offer at the negotiating table? On the battlefield, the situation is dire for Ukraine. Credible analyses indicate that Ukraine's best brigades are exhausted, attrited, and in some cases, surrounded. Russian forces are advancing along multiple fronts. There are reports of Ukrainian units falling back only to discover that the defensive lines they were promised don't exist. The billions allocated for fortifications having been embezzled by corrupt officials. Where there should have been concrete trenches and obstacles, there are only empty fields and raw mud. Bereft of solid defenses, Ukrainian commanders are forced into a series of desperate counterattacks with underprotected, non-hardened equipment, vehicles without anti-drone cages, without proper armor, thrown into kill zones dominated by Russian drones and artillery. It is a bloodbath. Combat cohesion is breaking down, territory is being lost, and when Russia realizes it can secure all its war aims through force of arms, its incentive to negotiate diminishes to near zero. This is a tragedy, first and foremost, for the Ukrainian people, who have been led down a catastrophic path by a leadership that serves Western agendas rather than Ukrainian survival. Zelensky, an actor turned president, behaves like an asset of Western intelligence rather than a statesman. He reads scripts written for him by those who see Ukraine not as a sovereign nation to be protected, but as a tool to bleed Russia, a chessboard on which Ukrainians are the expendable pawns. The war's trajectory also has profound implications for Europe. European states have no real capacity to intervene directly, even if their rhetoric suggests otherwise. The British army is hollowed out and overstretched. The French military, the German Bundeswehr, none of them have the forces, logistics, or political backing needed to sustain large troop deployments in Ukraine. And without U.S. support, any coalition of the willing marching into Ukraine would be marching to its death. European leaders may talk about sending forces, but they know that Washington will not commit its own troops in a major combat role. Not now. Not while the American public is exhausted by endless wars and electoral politics punishes presidents who start costly foreign adventures. So what likely happens if the Trump peace plan is dead on arrival and sabotaged beyond repair? Russia continues to prosecute the war until it achieves all of its minimal objectives, securing the territories that have already joined the Russian Federation, extending control to strategically vital regions like Odessa, landlocking whatever remains of Ukraine, and potentially linking up with Transnistria, where hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens live under increasing pressure from pro-NATO authorities in Moldova. The longer the war drags on, the more political space Russia gains to pursue maximal goals. Initially, it may not have intended to advance as far as Odessa or to push beyond the Dnieper. Now, every day of Western intransigence and Ukrainian refusal to accept reality strengthens the case inside Russia for going further. Why stop halfway when you've already paid the price in blood and sanctions and know that your enemies will never accept a strong Russia anyway? There's also a broader pattern here. The same Western leadership class that has mismanaged the Ukraine conflict is now toying with confrontation in Venezuela and against other states like Cuba. There is talk in Washington of Latin Vietnam scenarios, with interventions justified by drug trafficking or invented humanitarian pretexts. But the hard military reality is that the United States no longer has the manpower, industrial base, or domestic political consensus to fight large-scale ground wars on multiple fronts. An invasion of Venezuela would require hundreds of thousands of troops, massive logistics through jungle and hostile terrain, and political will that simply does not exist. It would be Vietnam all over again, with Spanish instead of Vietnamese spoken in the villages and jungles. Thus, we see talk of negotiation, pressure campaigns, covert action, and preparation of pretexts. But even here, Any recklessly launched operation risks backfiring before the midterms, crippling whichever administration is in power. Americans have not forgotten Iraq's fake WMDs. They will not tolerate another obviously manufactured war of choice once the costs become clear. Parallel to all this, Gaza burns and bleeds. The so-called ceasefire periods have not ended the violence. They've only changed its tempo. Hundreds have been killed even during supposed pauses. Buildings continue to be demolished. Settler violence and land seizures intensify in the West Bank. The Greater Israel Project, the notion of expanding and consolidating a Zionist state over the ruins of Palestine and neighboring countries, continues behind the smokescreen of counterterrorism and self-defense. And yet, even if parts of Syria, Iraq, Gaza, and Lebanon are reduced to rubble, there is no realistic prospect that this will produce a stable, peaceful Pax Judaica. The societies being brutalized will not forget. They will not quietly accept their fate as permanent subjects of someone else's project. At the same time, Western societies themselves are fraying. In Britain, farmers are arrested in London while protesting peacefully. The very people who feed the nation being treated as criminals, even when they have complied with all police requirements, paid their congestion charges and marched lawfully. Pensioners and disabled protesters are manhandled by police on weekends for daring to oppose government policies. Meanwhile, budgets of austerity and poverty are imposed at home, while billions are sent abroad to fund wars, corrupt regimes, and geopolitical follies. Accountability is a mirage. Governments take citizens' money and spend it on foreign adventures and client states without genuine democratic oversight. In theory, there is parliamentary accountability. In practice, the House of Commons and other legislatures are stuffed with anonymous party apparatchiks, people unknown even in their own towns, who obediently rubber stamp whatever their leaders demand. The result is a political class that answers more to lobbies, foreign interests, and ideological networks than to their own citizens. Across the Atlantic, the United States is undergoing its own internal crisis. Trump, who built a base on the promise of ending stupid foreign wars and putting America first, has repeatedly surrounded himself with people who represent the very establishment he claimed to oppose. The John Boltons, the Marco Rubios, the Keith Kellogg's. He has allowed Zionist and neoconservative interests to infiltrate and shape his foreign policy. Now, as leaks and sabotage target his peace initiative on Ukraine, his political capital is eroding. He risks becoming a lame duck president long before his term is up. If he walks away from Ukraine and Russia later wins decisively, his enemies will accuse him of abandoning Ukraine. If he escalates or keeps the U.S. deeply entangled, he will be accused of breaking his promise to stay out of foreign wars. Either path is politically dangerous, and yet, if he genuinely wanted to be remembered as a peace president, there is a clear path. Cut off weapons, money, and intelligence for Ukraine. Publicly state that the United States will no longer subsidize a lost war. Tell the Europeans they are free to replace the U.S. if they wish, but that Washington is done. That would force Kiev to confront reality. It would also expose Europe's impotence and compel European populations to ask hard questions about the leaders who dragged them into this mess. The tragedy is that the Western establishment in Washington, London, Brussels, and elsewhere has bound its identity to the idea of defeating Russia, containing China, and enforcing a unipolar order that no longer exists. Their media arm dutifully pumps out propaganda. Ukraine is winning, Russia is collapsing, Moscow is isolated, its economy doomed, its president on the verge of death. Reality refutes all of this, but the narrative machine cannot admit error. When that narrative machine turns its full energy towards sabotaging even the possibility of peace, we arrive where we are now. A war that could have ended long ago continues. A flawed but potentially workable peace plan is transformed into a poisoned chalice. A continent drifts toward deeper crisis, and ordinary people in Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and across the global south pay the price. Russia, meanwhile, moves with deliberate, grinding determination, both diplomatically and militarily. Its political and military establishments understand that the sanctions won't suddenly vanish, that they are already under maximum Western pressure, that there is little more the West can do short of direct war. So the question inside Russia becomes, if we are already treated as pariahs and sanctioned to the hilt, why should we restrain ourselves on the battlefield? Why not secure once and for all the territories and buffers needed to prevent future invasions and destabilization? In that sense, the sabotage of Trump's original 28-point plan may have sealed Ukraine's fate. Instead of a negotiated compromise that leaves Ukraine with a reduced army, neutral status, and some territory still under its control, the current path leads toward unconditional surrender, territorial dismemberment, and long-term strategic defeat for Kiev and its Western backers. Nobody who cares about human life should welcome that outcome. But if you look coldly at the logic of events, the trajectory of the war, and the fanaticism of those in the West who prefer escalation to admission of failure, it is difficult to see how else this ends. The Russian machine is grinding forward. The European armies are hollow. The American public is exhausted, and the so-called peacemakers inside Western governments are either sidelined, compromised, or sabotaged by the very structures in which they serve. This winter, there will be blood on the snow in Ukraine. There will be hunger in Gaza. There will be anger in the streets of Europe. And there will be a stark choice in Washington and other capitals. Cling to fantasies of total victory and global hegemony, or accept a multipolar reality in which Russia, China, Iran, and others are not defeated vassals, but enduring powers with their own interests and red lines. From where I stand, Russia has made its decision. It will not allow itself to be invaded through Ukraine again. It will not accept a NATO or EU-branded army of 800,000 on its frontier. It will not allow its wealth to be looted to rebuild hostile regimes. And it will not let its sons and daughters fight again in 20 years. The same war it can finish now. The real turkey in this Thanksgiving drama is not the ceremonial bird pardoned on the White House lawn, nor the caricatured villains of Western propaganda. The real turkey is the Western political class that thought it could provoke, encircle, sanction, and bleed Russia without consequence, and now finds itself trapped in a war it cannot win, a narrative it cannot sustain, and a crisis it cannot honestly explain to its own people.